bang, king, boom.
On the height of those departed here and on the killed right away. What we have just seen on display, this must have belonged mostly to people killed in gas chambers. We can say this knowing what was the fate of the great majority of Jews sent to Auschwitz, from whom such belongings we saw were stolen. But now in block number 7 we will see living conditions for the people incarcerated in Auschwitz I. What those conditions were like, how they also changed. So initially in the first months in buildings where the prisoners lived, there were even no beds. So initially the prisoners, they slept on the floor, they slept on some straw, or later some straw mattresses placed on the floor. But even when there were bunk beds placed in rooms in which prisoners lived with overcrowding, that was often the case how two prisoners, they would share a narrow place to sleep, share a bunk. So also prisoners' access to sanitary facilities, that was very limited, you may imagine. So here we will see rooms with toilets and wash basins, but they are only on the ground floor for that entire two-story building, where also on the upper floor there are rooms in which prisoners lived. So typically prisoners, they entered such sanitary rooms not only collectively, but also in a hurry, hurried up by supervisors, for example, early in the morning, after being woken up, before going to the places of work. There was some little time given for prisoners for them to try to relieve themselves, use some water to wash in such overcrowded sanitary rooms. But so, when we are here in block number 7, I also want to give some commentary concerning photographs you can see on the walls. Those who have entered already, you can see such examples of individual photographs of inmates, of newly registered prisoners of Auschwitz. Before we can all see such photographs, let me give some context. So the Nazis, they often kept very detailed documentation concerning registered prisoners of Auschwitz. So a part of documentation, those were also photographs. That was a common practice until early 1943. That was then a common practice in Auschwitz, how a new prisoner could be photographed after undergoing what was called the registration process, the introductory procedures which a new inmate underwent. So here we can see, of course, only examples of photographs, copies of some of such photographs which survived, which are now preserved, kept in our archive department. On the left side, among photographs on the left, you can see now faces of women. So women began to be deported here only later, because until late March of 1942, in almost the first years of the Kamp's operation, there were only men incarcerated in Auschwitz. But with the start of deportations of women, they became overall about 1/3 of the prisoners of Auschwitz. Among approximately 400,000 people who became prisoners of Auschwitz, about 1 in 3, those were female inmates. So let's notice, because on photographs you can see, for example, how a prisoner received a number. We can say this number, it was basically intended to replace a prisoner's identity, or replace a prisoner's name. We can often hear survivors say that the Nazis tried to reduce them here just to numbers. It was by a number, not by a name, but by a number, how a prisoner was officially recognized in the camp. And such numbers were given chronologically. The higher the number, the later the date of the registration was, but also numbers were given separately in a separate series to male and female inmates. In Auschwitz, such numbers were not only sewn to uniforms, we can see on photographs a number presented sewn to a uniform, but here in Auschwitz such numbers also started to be tattooed. You might have heard of the people, survivors, with numbers tattooed, which means that this person must have been incarcerated in Auschwitz. It was only in Auschwitz. Among Nazi camps where there was that practice implemented of also tattooing a number. It was typically tattooed on a left forearm. So the photographs we can see in different categories. So those classified as the political prisoners, they received a red inverted triangles. In some triangles you can see also a letter visible. For example, a letter P in a triangle which stood for a Pole. This letter showed a nationality of an inmate. Jewish inmates, they received two triangles put together, so a yellow triangle, and on top of it an inverted triangle, what resembled a shape of the Star of David. But also there was a category of prisoners classified as antisocial who received black triangles. Pink triangles, they were given to homosexual inmates, those imprisoned in Nazi camps because of their homosexuality. Purple triangles, they identified the Jehovah's Witnesses, members of this religious group that was persecuted by the Nazis. The Jehovah's Witnesses imprisoned in Nazi camps, they received purple triangles. Their fellow inmates, for example, a Kapo, that was a prisoner supervisor of what was called commando. Commando, that was a word for a working group of inmates, so Kapo, that was a prisoner supervisor of it, or a block elder who was a prisoner supervising other inmates living in a block building, a block elder. So being a functional inmate came with certain privileges which other prisoners in general did not have. For example, better living conditions. Among rooms we saw in this corridor, we could see a room in which there is a single bed to sleep in, a separate room to live in. That was that privilege of a block elder, that functional inmate with this role of a block elder. So not only could we see photographs, also below at the photograph you could see some pieces of information about an inmate, what we know about him or her from some surviving documentation. At the very bottom, you specifically in block number 10 in Auschwitz I, Karl Klauberg carried out his experiments on women, young female prisoners kept in block number 10. So Karl Klauberg, he was a German gynecologist who tried to discover the most efficient method for mass sterilization, for non-surgical mass sterilization of people. What he did, such experiments, he conducted that was connected to the Nazi racial ideology, according to which some ethnic groups, nations were considered inferior to the Germans. So that was the goal, to reduce death rates among them. So here Klauberg carried out experiments basically with a total impunity, but after the war Klauberg, he was later held in the Soviet imprisonment. He was held in the Soviet Union until 1955. After this time Klauberg returned to his native country, to Germany. Klauberg actually tried to restart his medical career in Germany, but after his crimes were publicly revealed, there were charges brought against him, but Klauberg died shortly after. Before he faced a trial, he died, where you will see some candles, flowers for commemoration. We will see what we call the death wall, the place of execution. That's a reconstruction now, because the Nazis dismantled this original, what we call the death wall, but we can see this reconstruction of the exact place where executions were carried out. Let's not stop here to see. So naked victims were undressed before an execution. Naked victims were led from block number 11. They would face what we call the death roll, and they were shot in the back of the head. So you can see not only that execution site of the death roll, on the left you can see also two wooden posts. We can move a bit further here to see on the left side such two wooden elements here on the left. These are wooden posts. You will notice that there is a metal hook attached. That was for a punishment. So a prisoner would hang tied behind a back. A prisoner would hang from a hook in such a way deliberately that prisoner's feet would not touch the ground. I'm giving this a commentary here now because later we will enter this place in silence after first visiting block 11. We will enter that place later but in silence. So let's approach block number 11 and in it we will enter the basement of the camp prison. So basically we can call it the prison in a prison, a prison in a concentration camp. That was a place of an imprisonment in and of itself. But the Nazis will also punish prisoners for different activities of what were considered to be forbidden resistance activities. You may imagine how some prisoners engaged, for example, in such activities, like organizing escapes or having some secret contact with outside world. For example, prisoners from the resistance movement, they try to send some secret messages outside the camp to the outside world, informing them about what was happening here in Auschwitz. So, if a prisoner was suspected of such forbidden resistance activities, one of such forms of punishment that would be the detention in this basement of block number 11. But so outside block number 11, the Germans carried out executions of not only some of the registered prisoners of Auschwitz, about whom it was decided that they would be executed, but also of arrested Polish people from a nearby area, those sentenced to death by the German summer court. Here in Auschwitz, in block number 11, there was such practice in one period of the camp's existence, when typically some every few weeks this German summer court came to block number 11 here in Auschwitz. They conducted trials for different offenses as they were regarded by the German occupiers. But basically we can call them mock trials. Such trial lasted typically. So before we go downstairs, in the basement, audio connection may not always work well. Let me give some commentary here about the cells we will see. In cell 22, we will see standing cells. So a standing cell, that was a narrow space surrounded by walls from every side, where in a standing cell, basically with no possibility of any movement in a standing cell, for prisoners stood for typically several subsequent nights of that punishment. We will see also cell 20, we call it a dark cell. In it, you will see only a small opening in the wall. That was the only access to natural light, fresh air, in what we call a dark cell, cell 20. We will see also one by one. In the basement, we are not allowed to photograph.
तो यार ये ना ये सामने डेथ वॉल है. तो यहाँ पे होता क्या था कि जो प्रिजनर्स हैं तो अंदर साइलेंस रखनी होती थी. तो ये डेथ वॉल थी जहाँ पे प्रिजनर्स को मार दिया जाता था। और उसके पास हम एक सेल में गए थे जहाँ पे प्रिजनर्स को स्टार्व करके मार दिया जाता था। एंड देन देयर वाज अ फादर कॉल्ड मैक्सिमिलियन गॉल्बे जिनने अपनी लाइफ दी थी दूसरों को बचाने के लिए स्टार्व होकर।
Now, as you can see from here as well, behind the wall there is a flag in colors of white blue stripes, resembling colors of uniforms that were given for the prisoners to wear. So we can see this flag that was chosen to commemorate the camps prisoners, the camps victims. What is its symbolism in such colors we can see of white blue stripes. So the next building that we will enter here in Auschwitz I, that is what was the crematorium building, but on our way you can see buildings number 21, 20 and 19, which together with block number 28, they became hospital buildings. But what wasn't a hospital as we typically understand such place its functions, because not only was that hospital overcrowded, badly equipped, but also that was the place of pseudo-medical activities. For example, selections among inmates. You may remember we saw photographs from Birkenau, including the photograph showing us the selection among Jewish new arrivals when the SS men decided who would become a prisoner and who would be killed right away in a gas chamber. But the SS men also carried out every so often selections among the prisoners by choosing especially the prisoners considered to be too sick, not likely to recover quickly. They were in the greatest danger of being selected to be killed. And in the hospital, this method of killings, those were injections, lethal injections, typically injections of phenol, a toxic substance, phenol, that was injected straight into a heart muscle, leading to basically an immediate heart failure. So also among buildings you can see on our way on the left with many chimneys, we can see what was the kitchen building on our left side. And next to the kitchen you will see the collective gallows. We are after our visit to the courtyard of Block 11, the place of executions by shootings, but the SS men, they also carried out executions in the camp on public display, the executions by hanging. We can say terrorize the prisoners, show them what would be likely reprisal for taking part in resistance activities. The prisoners, they would watch and observe such public executions. Discovered that they helped in organizing an escape of some of their fellow inmates from their working group. So we can see the collective galleries here, because next to us, but to your right, you can see the area that was Appellplatz. On the right side, we can see what was called the Appellplatz. So we can say that was the central assembly place here in Auschwitz I. That was a very strong revolt when prisoners assembled. So also, next to this Radical Square, you can see a booth of this wooden structure on the left side, close to us. Which was a kind of a shelter, a kind of a place to stay inside in case of bad weather conditions, rain, snow, for example, for Rapportführer. The Rapportführer was responsible for supervising workers. That was his function, Rapportführer. But unlike prisoners for workers in different weather conditions, they stood outside in rows until this roll call was declared completed. So typically, it was ordered 2 times a day in the morning before the prisoners would go to places of work, and later in the afternoon there was that another roll call ordered. When prisoners all assembled, what was checked, that was if the number of prisoners added up as it was supposed to, given changes that were due to not only deaths but also transfers of inmates into Auschwitz or from here to other Nazi camps. What also could be discovered, that was if there weren't any escapes among the prisoners in between such countings. Prisoners lived but also outside the fence we will see there is the territory which belonged to the camp. The camp's territory was not limited to this area surrounded by double fence. So we will enter the crematorium building in a moment, and in the crematorium building we will see what was the gas chamber used here in Auschwitz I. So actually this basement we saw in block number 11, that was the place of the first experimental mass murder using Zyklon B. Before there was a gas chamber here in Auschwitz. The Nazis carried out this murder on over 800 people, approximately 600 Soviet prisoners of war sent to Auschwitz, and also over 200 sick prisoners from the camp's hospital. They were murdered in what was that first experimental mass killing using Zyklon B in the basement of block number 11. But that basement, that wasn't a suitable place for repeated mass killings. It was, as we saw, the camp's prison, so subsequently a gas chamber it was located in the crematorium building. So right outside this double fence you can see buildings of what were to your left. You can see what was the hospital currently SS1. To your right we can see what was the camp's administration building, the camp's commandant's office. So let's gather there outside of this double fence.
Double fence.
You may remember from my earlier commentary the first of the longest serving commandant of Auschwitz, that was Rudolf Hess. So in a moment, and close distance, we can see where he lived with his family, with his wife and their children. After some time, Hess was later delivered to the Polish authorities in Warsaw. There was his trial held. He was found guilty of crimes he committed. He received a death sentence. It was decided that his execution would take place here on the grounds of the former camp, of which he was the longest serving commandant. So from the place of execution of Rudolf Hess, you can see, but right behind me, you can see what was of the crematorium building. Before we enter it, let me give some commentary here outside, because we will enter the building from here, you can see right behind me. But the victims led to the gas chamber, they entered on the other side, where we will later leave. But by entering from here, we will turn left, we will enter what was the gas chamber. The SS men, standing on the roof, they dropped pellets of Zyklon B into the gas chamber, what released hydrogen cyanide in the gas chamber. That was this lethal effect of Zyklon B. You may remember, when we enter the gas chamber in the ceiling, in some places in the ceiling, you can notice square openings. That's where the pellets of Zyklon B were dropped into the gas chamber. So we will see first where mass killings were carried out, and subsequently we will enter the adjacent room with Avens furnaces. So let's remember, knowing that we are entering the place of murder of thousands of victims, we have to now remain silent.